that I am recording this session so everyone's aware. So my name is Nicole Joniak. I am from the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Library Committee, and we are thrilled to welcome George Lakey, one of Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting's own, and he will be discussing his second edition book, which was just released, Facilitating Group Learning, Strategies for Success with Diverse Learners. And to give us a little background on George, he recently retired from Swarthmore College, but he has also taught at Haverford College, the University of Pennsylvania, Woodbrook in England, and at Pendle Hill. So he has trained and launched national networks of trainers in the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Russia, and Thailand. And so in summary, he has led over 1,500 social change workshops on 5 continents. And his 10 books have been about change, including How We Win, which was published in 2018. So we're going to make sure everybody's silenced in the beginning, and then we'll go ahead after the half hour and open up for questions and answers. People can feel free to raise their hand, or you can type your question in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, George.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. And please keep track of the time, because sometimes I don't do that very well. And I really want to maximize the chance for a discussion. So if I have more stories than there's time, just let me know and I'll finish up. And I do want to start though by saying that Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting has a real stake in the bio that you just described, because for many years now, I've been conducting a ministry that has been supported by the meeting that has had to do with training. And it was the phase of that ministry in the 90s that gave rise to an organizational expression called Training for Change, which has now been going 30 years, giving workshops all over the world. And it got its initial impetus through the support and belief in the value of education by Central Philadelphia. And so I just want to emphasize that. I really don't think that a number of the stories that you'll hear would have happened if it hadn't been for Central Philly people. And I think we can be very proud of our community that such support is available. Okay, so let's get right into stories, because I love stories, and the book is a compilation of stories with a bit of theory knitting things together. And one of the strong pieces of theory is that it pays in the beginning of a workshop or of a course, if you're teaching in a university or something, to build a container being another name for safety, a sense that people belong there, and this is a good place for adventure. It's a good place to take a fresh look at whatever it is they believed up until then, and so on. And so this story has to do with what's possible when you have a container. The section is called How People Teach Themselves when the container is strong. When participants in a workshop know their goals and the container is strong, they can thrive with their own initiative and teaching themselves. I had an experience of that in Decatur, Illinois, when I led a 2-day course in nonviolent civil disobedience for 3 unions that were simultaneously on strike. By the end of the first day of training, the container was strong. I was invited to the union meeting that evening, and I stood to one side of the crowded union hall. It wasn't the workshop, it was their meeting, watching the proceedings with a cup of coffee in my hand. A woman came up to me. "Have you seen the posters around the building announcing support groups for women?" she asked. Getting a yes, she went on, "Well, those are for the wives and mothers of male workers, not for the women workers like me in the union. What do you think? Should we female workers have support groups? Or would that be divisive?" Well, I took a sip of coffee, looking her in the eye. "What do you think?" "I think we need them," she said vehemently. I come from several generations of women who worked in factories, and we deserve a place where we could be together. What do you think? That's an interesting idea, I said. What do you think? We do deserve our own space, she said. It won't be divisive at all. I'm putting up posters and announcing a meeting tomorrow. Thanks, she said with a smile, and she walked off. Hardly 15 minutes went by before an African American man came over to me, and we repeated virtually the same conversation, replacing blacks for women. He also thanked me as he left, and I smiled while thinking that facilitation is sometimes the easiest job in the world. You can tell I'm grateful for this opportunity to read these stories because I get to relive them myself. Okay, so this has to do with my theoretical belief that all groups have a secret life among themselves, and it mostly communicated among themselves non-verbally, but also verbally during breaks and so on and so on. And that secret life, which is secret from the facilitator, it's a great help if the facilitator can figure out a little bit about what's going on. And so here's a story that illustrates how the secret life of groups, one reason why it's helpful to know what's going on is because the secret life of groups can really enhance the learning and make the learning go like crazy in the group. Or the secret life can get in the way of learning and the group can build a resistance to the learning. So the group as a group is very important. Over 300 people were gathered. So this is an illustration of the importance of the secret life of the group. Over 300 people were gathered from dozens of countries in a hill town near Mumbai, India, for a world work seminar. So this was not a seminar that I organized. I was simply an attender for somebody else's conference or workshop. On the third day, the floor was opened for a leadership initiative from small support groups. To my surprise, Satish, one of my group members, took the floor and called for the rest of us to follow him into the center of the large circle. I enthusiastically jumped in, motioning to the others, who reluctantly followed. We sat cross-legged on the floor, looking expectantly at Satish to launch into something. Satish's winning smile turned uncertain as he searched for something to do. If you don't have something, give up the floor and give others a chance, someone called, and murmurs of agreement came from around the circle. A world work facilitator took the microphone and said, "It's time to let these folks go, but before we do, let's find out what's just been going on. I'm curious." Satish spoke first, confessing that he leapt into the center with absolutely no idea in mind. "George," the facilitator asked, "what prompted you to lead the rest of your gang into the center?" "I wanted to give a vote of confidence to Satish," I said. "We're in his country after all, and he's such a bright and articulate young man, I wanted him to lead." Another support group moved into the center to lead as our gang rejoined the audience. On the way to my seat, a participant said, "Hey, George, you might want to think some about what you just said." Later, during the break, two different participants came up to me, independently suggesting the same thing. Reflect on what I said in response to the facilitator's question. I drew a blank, just as I did when the first participant offered the suggestion. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, my roommate said, "By the way, George, that was interesting, what you said in the center about your reasons for mobilizing around Satish. I hope you'll think more about that." He turned out the light. At 4 a.m, I was subtly awake, completely alert and ready for inner work. What was that thing about Satish really about? It hit me. How many years has it been that white colonialists have come to India and other countries and selected leaders? How perfect that I used the tip-off word articulate. How confidently and unconsciously I stepped into the role of designator of Native leaders. I, with my higher rank as a white American and cluelessness about what was really going on inside Satish at the moment. I spent the rest of the night confronting the layer of racism within me, venting my sadness and despair that I've been conditioned so deeply, and praying for the strength to learn to be a better ally. In the morning, when the seminar reconvened, I asked for a brief moment at the microphone to share what I had learned and to thank the participants, all of them white, who got on my case so thoughtfully. The encounters with other participants out of public view brought me to my epiphany. For me, the workshop continued in the middle of the night, thanks to the secret life of the group. Some years ago, a man named Peck, what is his first name, and others have experimented, especially with religious congregations, to support them to become stronger, more united, more effective. And he wrote about his theory of how that works. And I got very fascinated with it and decided to use it. And I used it a number of times. It's when you sense as a facilitator that the group really wants to crash through a barrier, it wants to become a high performance team. And in its own estimation, it's a so-so group or congregation or organization. It's okay, but it's not a high performance one. And when you sense that that is what it wants to be, then you can set up a technique that this guy teaches on how to do that. It's a dynamic in the group that's so secret, though, that the group, even in its private life, doesn't see it coming. And what I'm referring to is a storm that can come in the group. It's a phenomenon that shows up in public, but isn't explicitly linked to the curriculum. I'll describe a case in story form, the better to encourage you to notice layers and complexities in the experience of the group that I shared. But my facilitator nose was telling me this group was starting to storm and didn't know what was happening. And if I could see the group through the storm, something good would happen. The young man was big enough to be a player in the National Football League. He was headed for the door, anger pulsing from his body. I got to the door first, blocking it. "You look really frustrated," I began, but was cut off. "Damn right I'm frustrated and mad as hell. I'm getting out of here." "You're mad, and look at the other participants, frustrated as can be." "Right, anybody would be. Nothing is happening here, and you're just fucking sitting there. Pardon my language, but I'm mad." "You have a right to be mad. The group hasn't found its way forward yet. You're part of the group. The group needs you." After more of that kind of dialogue back and forth, the football player did go back to the group, and I resumed my facilitator chair, trying my best to channel the Buddha. "It's the group's work to do," I kept telling myself. "I'll keep praying for them and see if I can keep everyone in the room, because that's an important part of their reaching the point they want to reach." The period that followed seemed like hours, filled as it was with painful attempts by various participants to bring the group together. The attempts were mostly reasonable, and none of them worked. "Let's try forming small groups to generate ways of moving the group forward," one student said. "We need more unity, so let's hold hands and sing," another student suggested. This was a student group. Another student challenged someone making jokes. "Stop being such a clown, you're distracting us." Students launched a dozen initiatives to try to get the group out of its stuck place, and all of them failed. The informal leader of the group, A quiet student who had been trying to maintain the morale of his despairing friends finally threw up his hands. "I don't know what to do," he said with anguish in his voice. He began to cry. The energy shift was palpable. Suddenly, the group was a community. Participants circled around the sobbing leader, touching him and each other. Tears were in many eyes. Facial muscles relaxed. The tension ebbed. I noticed the football player smiling with relief. The storm was over. So that's a bit woo-woo. So let me rush on to something that may be, we can get more in discussion of the storm theory later if you want to. Here's one that's much more straightforward, has to do with working with a group around difference, racial difference, any difference. And it was a student group. Again, was a Williams College group. I was asked by Williams College to come and do diversity work with the students. Williams College has a history of support for tolerance and liberal values. I was asked to lead a workshop for students who wanted to take a next step in their own acceptance of diversity, and I asked them to do a mingle. A mingle is when people simply, it's almost like there you are at a train station running into each other and you exchange something, and usually the facilitator gives you a formula of something to say, and the other person says their piece, and you go to other people. That's a mingle. So this will be a series of one-on-one encounters, I explained. Just walk around, and when you meet someone, shake their hand. One of them will say, "A difference between us that I notice is," and fill in the blank. The other will say, "Thanks for noticing," and you'll go on to someone else. See how many people you can greet with this formula. A difference between us that I notice is. Let's practice it one time. The initiator, whoever it is, will say what? And the responder will say what? Great. Please, on your feet, begin. With much giggling, the students moved around the lounge, expressing some of the differences they noticed. I was happy to see them outside their comfort zone, but they didn't seem to stray too far. After most students had gotten to everyone, I ended the exercise. What was that like? More giggling and murmurs. That was hard, someone said, and heads nodded vigorously. I found myself only saying the most obvious things, like somebody was wearing earrings and I was not. I felt ridiculous because I couldn't say some of the things that occurred to me. And I just went for the hairstyle or the color of the sweater, said another student. Anyone have any guesses about what makes that hard for you? I asked. It's no secret that we have a lot of differences here. Why not just say what they are? A thoughtful silence followed my question. A Black student spoke up. I'm the only Black student here tonight, he said. Nearly everyone shook my hand and said something. Not one of you said you noticed I was Black. I began to feel crazy. I asked students to turn to each other in small groups and wrestle with this question. What's at risk when we identify our differences? When they reported back, the discussion continued long into the night with an explosion of insights. What they didn't see as young people, however, and what is very important for their teachers to understand, was the historical context that makes an apparently easy task so difficult. And that chapter goes on talking about how difficult this culture sets us up to acknowledge difference, and what a hard place that puts us all in, and what we can do about that as teachers or as facilitators. Oh, I want to rush on to. Can I do this? Let's see. Yes, here's one of the things that teachers can do. This is what I did at Penn, semester after semester after semester. When I taught at Penn, I required as part of the course that people spend a weekend in retreat with me at a youth hostel in Fairmount Park, and that was required. And during the retreat, of course, people would get much closer, and we could do much deeper work. The University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s, when I was teaching there, was a socially segregated place. There were few African Americans, and those few protected themselves against pervasive racism by clustering together. My course came to be known to students of color as a safe and diversity-friendly place, so their numbers rose to 1/3 of the students. Each semester, I took the whole class on a weekend retreat, which I just said. The speak out became one reliable method of eliciting the conflict. This describes a speak out as a tool. I particularly remember one Saturday night when a dozen Black students did their speak out to the 24 or so white students. By that time, the number of Black students had kept increasing and increasing and increasing in my class because the word had gotten out. So there were a dozen Black students among the 35 or so. These Black students went all out, expressing their deep anger at the racism they encountered on campus and their determination to do what it took to maintain their dignity. The minds of the white students were blown, and I had the usual teacherly concern about how the class would reunite. After spending considerable time debriefing the white students, I touched base with the Black students who were caucusing on their own in the breakout room. I found the Blacks deep into laughter and congratulations. "How was the speak out for you?" I asked the Black students. "Oh, you'll see," came the answer. "We're going to party tonight." I brought all the students together for a closing circle. The ritual was barely over when hot music blasted and the Black students were calling the whites to dance with them. And all all the student parties I've been to, I've never seen people have a better time. The rest of the semester revealed in multiple ways the deepened understandings of the white students and the increasing assertiveness of the Blacks. There was a member of our meeting named Janet Riley who had and still has a strong concern for Quakerism in Russia. And she kept urging me to come to Russia and do training. I didn't want to do that. And kept refusing Janet's invitation because I just had so many biases against the Russians. I didn't think I could work with them effectively. But then I ran into a training collective, a brand new training collective that was organizing of Russians, young professionals who decided to drop out of their professions. Two of them were interpreters who had graduated from the top interpretation school, language interpretation school in Russia. And three of them were medical people, two doctors and one medical researcher. And they all said, we'll drop out of our profession, dedicate ourselves to training. We're going to dedicate ourselves to trying to make this, make democracy work in Russia, because this is the first opportunity, ever historically for us to do this. This was during the thaw, years ago, decades ago. And so there they were, 5 people ready to train Russians, and they had no clue how to do it. So they found me in an international conference in Holland, and they said, "George, please come coach us. We have no idea how to do it, but we're committed." I said, "Okay, I will come." So I stayed with Janet Riley in Moscow, who was very encouraging, I've got to say. While I worked with these young people, I worked with them for a decade. Back and forth to Russia, where I didn't want to go. The group called itself Golubka, which means dove in Russian. Let's see. So Any kind of experiential learning was new in Russia in those early days, and Golubka's workshops on democratic leadership and decision-making were hot items. People thought that was a sexy thing to learn how to do. I could tell, though, that most participants had ambivalent feelings about learning democratic process. On the one hand, they were eager to put the battle days of Stalinism and the Brezhnev stagnation behind them, with the corruption and power over and pretense of democracy that was going on. On the other hand, many felt some humiliation about losing status in the world of nations while the dysfunction of their country was exposed. Yes, they wanted to learn how to practice genuine democracy, but how could they know it would work in their culture? We didn't have the container yet in the workshop that would support direct work on that ambivalence, but it would have been foolish of my Russian colleagues and me to ignore the resistance to learning that was present in this particular workshop. Tremendous resistance to learning. So the participants needed to release feelings, their feelings. How could I get them to release their feelings? I turned to the Golubka Collective. Let's do a skit with 2 parts. You Golubkis, this is these five young people, you sit in the middle of the circle like a fishbowl that participants can observe. In part 1, I'd like you to mimic the features of the worst meetings you've ever attended. If people start to laugh, exaggerate some more. You do need to be serious and stay in character, though. The more they laugh, the better. Then in part 2, show them what a genuinely democratic group process looks like. Then we'll debrief, okay? The Russian participants nearly fell off their chairs laughing when they saw a lifetime of painful meetings unroll before their eyes. My Golubka friends were born comedians and they played it to the hilt. After part 2, we debriefed for the differences, which allowed the group to return again and again to the funniest parts of part 1 with fresh gales of laughter. That discharge of feelings opened the way to a high impact workshop. The wet-eyed hilarity of those Moscow participants made space for something new, and they eagerly tried out practices in the workshop that might support democracy. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's just about 11:30, but if you have any other stories you wanted to share before we go to Q&A, feel free.
Oh, so many. So many. Maybe this one will be especially interesting for friends. I was once asked to facilitate a strategy workshop for a Buddhist monk who led his fellow monks and nearby villagers in a movement to save Thailand's rainforest. In addition to the usual means of protest, they were also ordaining trees, solemnly wrapping the huge tree trunks in monks' robes to warn off the loggers. The movement's impact was growing. Only a week before I got there for the workshop, a key movement ally was murdered. And speculation was growing about how long it would be until the leading monk would himself be assassinated. I'd prepared a design for the 3-day workshop, but from the day of my arrival in Thailand, I was getting information that made the design seem inappropriate. In the car driving from Bangkok to the forest, I continued to learn more about the movement, and I continued to become more confused about how to design the workshop. To me, one of the more alarming bits of news was that the workshop would not simply be the head monk and the movement's secondary leadership, among the monks, but it would be an open workshop where I could expect villagers who had little, if any, literacy and had never been drawn into discussions about strategy or direction. Finally, we got there, and I was led into the presence of the leader. He looked at me and also looked through me. I see that you are worried about something, he said. Yes, I answered. My plan for the workshop now seems irrelevant, and I don't know what to do. Don't worry about what to do tomorrow, he advised. You will see in that situation what needs to be done. You will understand how to be present in that moment. Supper was rice and curry served from the wood fire where it was cooked. We stood around holding our bowls and chatting. I was standing next to two NGO, nonprofit staffers from Bangkok, who had come to watch the training. After some conversation, I told them I noticed that they weren't talking with the villagers. Why would we? They responded, one of them. We're from Bangkok. What could we possibly talk about with villagers? I was incredulous, but at least you're from the same country. I said, how do you expect me to connect with them when I'm from the other side of the planet? The first morning of the 3-day workshop dawned with me still without a plan. The head monk led us in a long morning walk through winding forest paths to a cliff with a view and a resident wolf. The other monks walked ahead of me. I walked along with the villagers, encountering the Buddhist precept of mindfulness. Whenever my attention strayed to anxiety about what I was going to do in the workshop, I tripped on a root or a branch hit my face. We sat in a semicircle at the cliff edge, and our leader led us in meditation. As a Quaker, I was grateful for such a beginning and went into a relaxed state. We spoke from the silence about the forest as a lung of the earth, about our duty to live peaceably as part of nature. Then it was my turn. My prayers had been answered. The anxiety had transformed into curiosity and then into confidence. I began to tell stories about Australians blockading ships carrying rainforest logs, Americans blockading ships docking to pick up weapons for killing people in Bangladesh, Burmese protesting on a mass scale for democracy, Gandhians interspersing protests with constructive program. The workshop became a feast of case studies. The stories worked for everyone. The drama caught the unsophisticated people who didn't quite know what the workshop was, and the strategic lessons were noted by those who were more knowledgeable. Once the workshop had momentum, we were able to create small groups to create campaign strategy thinking, report back to the general discussion, then return again to small task groups. At the end of the first day, a Thai NGO worker came to me and said she had been talking with the nuns and village women who were cooking for us. She had learned that a number of the women had asked permission to attend the workshop and were refused on the grounds that the women's role was to cook while the men studied. The next morning, I chose as a case study to tell the group an extended coal miners' strike in the mountains of Appalachia, a strike that was losing until the women of the coal towns joined the picket lines and took direct action. So you see, women can be a very powerful part of social movements. And I wouldn't be surprised someday, I said, if you invite me back to do another workshop, if I found women also in the workshop. I went on with other strategic issues. On the morning of the third day, I was surprised to find a sprinkling of women in the workshop, their eyes shining with anticipation. We continued with our strategy work, and as we were hosting the thinking of the task groups, we came to a group that had nothing to report. The face of the task group leader was covered with embarrassment. He clearly believed he owed me an explanation for their lack. You see, he stammered, this is so new to us. Our leader has never asked for our thinking before. The entire room became still. What happens now? I asked myself. I gave the monk my most open look of inquiry. He shifted in his robes. Yes, he said gravely, but we know that the movement is in a dangerous time. I believe it is appropriate now for all of us to think together. I exhaled. The elephant in the living room, the chance that he would be assassinated, was now stated. Outsider that I was, outside the web of rank and deference, which makes some kinds of work forbidden, I seized the moment. Your leader welcomes you to think with him about the movement situation, I say, as I nod to him. For the next round of task group work, I'd like you to consider the plans you need to make if the venerable monk, your leader, is arrested. How will you continue your movement? The group, all the groups, dug into their task with newly released energy. I watched a monk who as before sat quietly in his dignified and composed way. He never participated in the groups, of course, because he was above all that. So he just sat and paid attention. The training space was actually an old wooden shed with a large platform on one side. The participants all sat on that platform, leaving a circle of empty space around the leader, a kind of moat. My interpreter and I stood facing the platform and the participants. The task groups were ready with their reports, which they gave one at a time, including the task group that had not had a report previously. This time they did. The elements of the plan sounded reasonable to me, but the delivery by the task group leaders sounded hesitant, as if they still didn't give themselves the right to take action without their abbot. Again, trading on my outsiderness, I decided to raise the stakes. I'm hearing the plans you are making, but I'm not hearing your commitment to them, I said. So I want to challenge you. If you are serious about taking a new level of responsibility in this movement, I want you to express that by closing the empty space between you and the venerable, your leader. The day was sunny, but I would not have been surprised if thunder cracked at that moment and a lightning bolt hit the roof of the shed. The villagers looked stunned at the very suggestion. After what seemed like a very long time of stillness, someone moved, then another, then another. Gradually, the entire space was filled in with the bodies of the villagers and other monks. I exhaled again and again, looked expectantly at the monk. And what is that like for you, may I ask? The participants held their breath. Very slowly, the words came out. I am glad you have taken this action. He looked around. Now I do not feel so lonely. My philosophy is if you happen to be an outsider, use it.
Great wisdom. Thanks, George. All right. Anything else from you, George, before we start the Q&A here?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, anything else before we start the Q&A?
No, I think whatever strikes you is of interest to me.
Excellent. So before I start the Q&A, I did want to let people know that the book, this book that George recently published is available in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Library. And in spite of the library not physically being closed, but basically you can still check out books. So definitely let us know if you're interested in checking it out. And you can also purchase a copy through the publisher PM Press. So I'll put a link in the chat for that information if anybody's interested. And so for Q&A, you can either raise your hand or unmute your microphone. And so I'm going to start with David because David raised his hand early on. Did you want to start, David, and unmute yourself?
So George, greetings.
I did.
By the way, I bought your book many years ago, and I have not touched it, and not read it, because it didn't seem appropriate to my line. But I just want to say that it's going to become appropriate, and you, I can tell it's going to become very appropriate. I can feel it. So my question is this: so you and I know about Arnold Mendel, and I was at World Work, and I could tell you a great story about the Asians at World Work in DC, about the group life of the Asians. But I was thinking about your stories, and it occurred to me, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this. It seems to me that the one way of looking at your work as a facilitator is that you recognize there's a primary process, and that there really is also a secondary process. And as Mendel points out, and the secondary process exhibits itself in sort of indirect ways. And Mendel makes the assertion that the greatest growth is when you amplify the secondary process. And it seems to me that that's exactly what you're doing.
Bingo. And again, the role of the facilitator as an outsider to the group is to go for the stuff that the group maybe isn't aware of, and even if it is, doesn't want to acknowledge.
The edge, it's the edge.
It's
that's
the
why
edge.
that's why people don't want to go over it. It's too scary. But if you go over it, kaboom!
Whoa, what a relief. What a relief. And of course, also a new mess occurred, arises on the horizon, a new edge, a new possible thing. But it's
then of course you follow that.
Yeah.
And of course you follow that one. You follow that new edge. You keep on pushing those new edges.
Exactly. Adolescents do it all the time, and at least successful adolescents do it. It's what we sometimes forget to do as adults.
So George, can I tell you what my new edge is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the last few weeks I've been volunteering with the Black Doctors COVID Consortium. And I, for some crazy reason, I've had intimate conversations with Dr. Stanford, the voice, and her mentor, who was the first African-American female transplant surgeon in the US. A highly esteemed person. I was in a room with her on Tuesday for 5 hours. I was helping her and we just chatted. I introduced her to my grandmother's hands. She gobbled that book up. Without my knowledge, she loaded on Audible. Later on, she said, I'm going to look at this book when I'm going home. Listen to this book. And I didn't realize she had Googled it and downloaded when I was talking to her. She gave me her book. Anyway, my edge is that my hope is to be sent out home vaccinations. Right. And this morning I started crying because I'm also interested in listening to the Proud Boys. And this is what I think is up. And I don't know if it's going to happen. I think at some point I'm going to meet a white racist when we vaccinate them. And my edge is I'm going to listen to them. And I'm going to love them. And I'm going to bring them back. I'm going to tell them how to come back into love. Because they're all about hate. That's my job. That's my edge. We'll see what happens.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Make sure you didn't step on the power strip.
We're getting some interference there. Okay, any other questions? Next question.
So what did she say? What did you say?
Oh,
what did the participants say? We'd like to know what she said. I consider that a secondary signal, by the way. It's a disturbance. I want to know what disturbance is about.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it was coming from Karen's camera. I don't know if that was just background interference or not.
That's weird.
Yeah. Okay.
Hand me my flash.
David,
Right.
I think
so any other questions at this point?
David, I think you're aware of how hard it is to build a container via Zoom.
Yeah.
And we need that container to be able to do deeper work. Yeah.
Yeah. But George, I'm just curious. Oh, I'm sorry, Tina. I see you have a question.
Oh,
Please.
yeah, George, I was wondering, with your last story, that group that
Really?
had no ideas if they didn't have a leader, they must have had some thoughts. I was wondering if you had challenged them. Could you have challenged them to say, well, even with your leader, you must have your own ideas. They don't stop thinking. But you use different methods.
Right. Yeah, because that would be in a sense a kind of meta conversation, a conversation about their culture's attitude toward what people bring to the table. And in a highly hierarchical culture, the assumptions aren't the same as they are for us.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we kind of assume everybody brings something to the table, right? So speak up, da da da. And that's not what they're not brought up to believe that.
Uh-huh. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Women are brought up to cook food. Men are brought up to think strategy.
And if they have other thoughts that things might be different, I mean, do they have other thoughts, or do they just not even think that way?
Well, actually, I was very concerned wherever I went to mentor other trainers, and in Thailand, because they used me for 10 years, every year at least once. So about 4 years into that, as it looked like we had an ongoing relationship, I said, you know what, Thais can do what I do. So how about if I teach them how? So, oh my gosh. So as a result, the last 6 years, in addition to whatever else they wanted me to do, I would do a training of trainers. And therefore I was able to finish that decade with a network of Thai trainers. But it was up to them to recruit the people who wanted to be trainers, right? So they came to me with a list, and it was all men. I said, where are the women on this list? Well, but it's men who do that kind of thing in this country. And I said, you know what? And I was co-facilitating with a woman, Karen Ridd. We did a lot of the Thai work together. Amazing, amazing trainer. And so we said, we'll be back to you. We want 15 minutes or something. So we went next door and we looked at each other, and Karen said, I know that we do everything we can not to be imperialist white American know-it-alls who tell other people their cultural ways are wrong. We don't want to do that, right? We don't want to fall into that stereotype, the ugly American. We don't want to do that. On the other hand, how can we start a new bunch of a new training capacity in Thailand that's all male? So we decided, no, in this case, we're going to have to take the risk of being ugly Americans and insist. And so we went back, and I felt that even more strongly than Karen did. And so we went back to the guy and said, sorry, but that was a rough draft. Now you have a chance to recruit a new batch of people that will be, at least 40% women. And so he did. And one of those women became a very strong feminist. And then she was amazing. Every time I co-facilitated with her, she was this flaming, person making sure that women were supported as fully as possible to, step outside the norms of, acceptable women's behavior. But it's a big fight. Every culture has fights like that of one sort or another, right? And the job of an outsider, I always felt, thanks to friends contributing money to make my trips possible and so on, was to bring an outsider's rank, because outsiders bring rank, to bear on supporting those who are shit on in that culture, or not deprived, to be able to move up. And so the speak out that I described at the University of Pennsylvania, Black students speaking to whites, well, we did that all the time in this country. So, so often I did Black speak outs to whites, but also women's speak outs to men, also LGBTQ people speak outs to heterosexuals, also at Penn, because lots of Jewish folks were there, and there was a secret discrimination going on there, Jewish speak out to non-Jews. So I had all this going in the US, but then it was like another step to go to a culture not my own, right? And I had to step very carefully, and always got to be on the side of liberation somehow or other, but sometimes not as, certainly not every week like I could do at an Ivy League university here in the US. But I could, so we literally had women's speak outs in Thailand. Once Wayporn, this woman, this fierce woman feminist, was able to co-facilitate with me. We would do workshops where she would go off with the women and coach them, and then they would come back and do a speak out to the men. And it was fantastic. It was fantastic to see. I see Mona's hand.
Yes, thank you, George. This has been really interesting, and it makes me wonder as you're telling stories from different decades. Have you noticed your approach to training changing over the years? And if so, could you kind of describe your own development in that way?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, first there was what I learned from other teachers, as a student, and then there was the 70s popular education period when we were learning from Pablo Freire in Brazil. So that whole popular education thing was coming in, and Movement for New Society that I was very much a part of, then adapted our training to include those tools and that approach, very much more egalitarian, very much more pro-liberation. But then I was so fascinated by acquiring additional toolboxes, you might say. And so I got involved with reevaluation counseling and learned some tools from there that I was able to use. I was able to use reevaluation counseling at Penn, for example, with students in a modified way. I did a lot of experimentation. Then the world work that David refers to, that Arnold Mindell has brilliant toolbox that I've been able to access, and there's stories of that from here. And what other story? Rod Napier, who taught for years educational psychology at Temple and at Penn, developed a bunch of his own tools that I sat at the feet of him and learned a bunch of his stuff. So I've been very, I keep, so in my life as trainer, which I no longer consider myself that, I've tried to resign from training actually. So I no longer have that kind of eagerness to keep acquiring new toolboxes with new theoretical supports that I did. But I did in my training life, my whatever it was, 60 years of training life, I did that 50 years. I did that assiduously. Yeah, it's tremendous fun. I mean, I think it's way more fun to be a facilitator if one's picking up new tricks all the time and trying them out. Yeah.
Thanks, George. So it looks like we have for maybe one more question, and this is from Greg Barnes. Before I start with Greg, I just wanted to mention David Shen commented. He said, "Someday I want to be a part of the an Asian American maybe community. I'm not sure." To speak out to the non-Asians in this country. So very on point there, David. So the question from Greg is, what is Training for Change doing today? What do you see as its future?
Oh, I'm so proud of Training for Change. After 15 years, I wore myself out, actually. And so, and I thought we'd done such a fantastic job of training. The basic mission was to bring the latest and most powerful forms of training to activists, sometimes in a sense being Robin Hood in reverse, like taking stuff that only corporate executives were getting and making it available to activists and so on. So we did that, and we transformed most activist training in the country and in some other countries. And so I thought, okay, let's declare victory and be done, because I'm done. So the board said, how about this? How about we do what farmers do? Farmers sometimes let a field lie fallow. This seems to be a tired field, it's not growing as much corn as usual. So we'll let it lie fallow for a year. So we'll do that with Training for Change. We'll let it lie fallow. We won't do training for a year, and we'll see what is asked of us. Are people coming to us, beating on our door? Hey, or maybe you're right. Maybe we did our thing. And so for a year, Training for Change was was on the was fallow, and then it turned out it was getting a blitz of requests to, especially in the training of trainers field. And so the people that I had mentored, because I was mentoring like crazy, a bunch of training associates and working with them, came forward and said, okay, we'll take over from George. George just, he's pooped, he's out of it, we'll take over, that's no problem. And so an additional 15 years so far of life. First 15 years with me, second 15 years with the training associates, and they are going strong. They're prioritizing training groups of color, and their website is really exciting. I advise you to check their website out, and I'm so proud of them. And yeah, just overjoyed at Training for Change's ability to keep being very, very relevant and up to date.
All right. Well, thank you so much, George. This was really great. We all really enjoyed hearing these stories, and we can't wait to read more of them. So yeah, and we're looking forward to your new publication, which you told me a little bit about. I don't know if you want to mention it.
Oh, my memoir is coming at long last. I figured at 82, if you don't write your memoir at 82, you really can't count on writing it at 87. So you better do it, George. So I wrote my memoir. So it's in the hands of the editor. Happy to say.
So that will be our next talk, maybe. We'll see about the timing, but certainly to hear from you again.
Thanks so much for
right,
the chance to tell these stories. You know, I get to relive them when I tell them. So it's just a tremendous support. It's just a lovely, lovely thing. And to be sharing with my home community that itself played a part in making those stories possible. I mean, that's really coming home in a very deep way. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, George, and everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
George. Wow, I love all the stories. I just love all the stories.
I couldn't follow all of them. I was
George.
unmuted.